Thanks everyone for coming back, for still holding on. This is the last one for today. I hope you have fun so far. I'm going to talk about the fiscal theory of the price level. I know the title of the talk on the program is slightly different. I'm also going to talk about Sargent and Wallace, but it's more like a side digression I put inside the talk. That's why I think this is the more fundamental title. And I'm doing it without, which is the traditional way, and with bubbles, which connects it to what Markus has done. So basically what I am doing is less microfinance in this talk and more monetary economics. So one key issue in monetary economics is the issue of price level determination. So that's a fundamental question. What determines the price level? Which is equivalent to asking what determines the value of money, because the price level is just how many units of money do you have to pay to get a good. And then how do policy choices affect the price level or inflation? Okay? And the classic answer in monetary economics that has been given long before most of us in this room were born is money supply and demand. Okay? So that is the monetarist answer, and then the monetary authority can determine the price level or inflation by setting the money supply. The issues with these answers are at least twofold, probably there are more. So there's this Sargent and Wallace paper that I talk about later that has pointed out already in the 80s that fiscal considerations may still matter, even if you are in such a regime where the monetary authority sets the money supply. And the reason is that the monetary authority may be forced by the fiscal authority to supply some money to monetize the debt or to create seigniorage revenue. So fiscal considerations may still play a role. That is Sargent and Wallace. I talk about that more later. A more fundamental issue is that in modern models and also in reality, we think about the money supply as endogenous because we have interest rate policy. And then you get nominal indeterminacy. You lose your nominal anchor, the money supply, because you supply money as needed to generate a certain interest rate. And then there's nothing left that determines the price level in those models. Think about any standard New Keynesian model. Usually it's somewhere swept into the footnotes, but you will usually not have a determined price level. Okay, so the fiscal theory of the price level is a theory that points out a systematic link between fiscal policy and nominal goods prices. Okay, so it's not so much about monetary policy, but really about fiscal policy. So specifically for a government that issues nominal debt that's denominated in its own currency, and that is committed, though that can be relaxed somewhat, to not default on nominal liabilities. A government that issues debt in its own currency can do that if it's committed not to default. That means it's just going to print up money to pay its debt. So there is nothing infeasible about these assumptions. Okay? And if fiscal policy is conducted in a certain way, then that systematic link that the fiscal theory points out can render the price level determinate, no matter whether you conduct a monetary policy by money supply or by interest rate policy. But even more generally, if we go beyond these specific policies that make the price level determinate, the FTPL, a short form of fiscal theory to price level, relationship is always present in macro models. And there are important fiscal requirements for certain monetary policy objectives like price stability that are usually also somewhere in the background or the footnotes, but that are still present in these models, and therefore the FTPL is even then useful to think about what fiscal requirements do we have to generate price stability. Very starkly, in the words of Chris Sims, in one of the first FTPL papers, he concludes in a fiat money economy, inflation is a fiscal phenomenon even more fundamentally than it is a monetary phenomenon, of course alluding to Friedman's idea or Friedman's statement that inflation is always and everywhere monetary phenomenon. So what I want to do in this lecture is I briefly talk about the basic FTPL. Some of you may know, particularly those that come out of an econ program, some of you may not. Then I point out the connections and differences to the Sargent and Wallace ideas. And then I go a little bit more into what Markus has already briefly touched upon on the FTPL with a bubble. So how does the FTPL still work if we have a bubble, and how can we select a unique equilibrium in the type of model that Markus has presented? Any questions? All right, so let me start with a very boring model. It's very boring because it's basically a representative agent model. So I take the model that Markus presented and I take out anything of interest and just have a representative agent model. So there are a bunch of households. They have log utility. You've seen that already. They all manage capital. Okay? Capital produces some output. and Markus always had an A here. I just put it to 1 to simplify. The government comes along and levies some taxes from the capital holders. I call that tau, as in Markus's lecture. There's no A here because capital produces 1. But actually, those taxes are equivalent to lump sum taxes. Why? Because there's no investment, no depreciation, no idiosyncratic risk. So you can also relabel everything. Instead of capital, you call the flows that capital produces an endowment, and then you're taxing an endowment, which is like having a lump sum tax. Okay? These guys can trade the endowment, so it's like a Lucas tree, but also for that model it will not matter because they will never trade. It will only matter later on I put back idiosyncratic risk, and then it matters that in principle I can trade. But we can still price this thing, okay? And again, QK is the price of capital. Then in the aggregate, I assume that there is 1 unit of capital because there's no investment and no depreciation. If we start with 1, we'll always have 1. So that makes things easier because I don't need to carry around this capital K all the time. And then there is consumption. Well, that's aggregate consumption is just individual consumption aggregated. That in the goods market clearing must be equal individual production aggregated, which is just capital aggregated, which is 1. Okay? Okay, that's basically the model, except that there's a government. And the government issues nominal bonds, exactly like what Markus did. There's a face value that I call script B. It evolves at a certain law of motion. Everything is deterministic here. There's an initial value of debt already outstanding. We don't talk about where that comes from. It's there. And that's a state variable of the model. The government pays some interest rate. It doesn't play any role. You can set it to 0 if you like. And then there is a real value of the bonds. And I call this again often QB. There's no K here now because K is always 1. Okay? But in principle, the real value of the bonds is, of course, the nominal value divided by the price level. So you see already that the value of the bonds, an asset price, and the price level, the money price of goods, is, of course, tightly connected here. Okay? And then the interest that the government has to pay is paid by either issuing new bonds or by raising taxes. That's the budget constraint. Here's the interest rate in nominal terms. This is new nominal bond issuance, and that is tax collection, exactly as in Markus's model. We can rearrange that a little bit using this QB notation and write the bond growth rate as the interest rate minus taxes divided by the value of debt. Okay? And now I do the first thing that's slightly different from Markus's lecture. I'll be a bit more careful asking what type of policies can the government actually pursue. Okay? So you could, somewhat less careful, just define a government policy as a sequence of actions for these 3 variables, and an equilibrium as a bunch of other sequences that come from the household side that together with that sequence of actions make all markets clear. But the issue with that is that the government cannot really specify these 3 guys independently because the government is bound by this budget constraint. And that budget constraint depends on a price, which is outside the government's control. So once we want to talk about price determination, we don't just want to make the government choose a sequence of actions, because that would be like cheating. We could just pick any sequence of actions so that the only price consistent with the government's constraint is the one we want. And then we can say this is the only way we get an equilibrium. But of course, that kind of doesn't answer the question, what would the government do if the private sector coordinated to a different price? So the right way to approach this is to say, specify a policy rule that specifies how the government chooses its policies, possibly contingent on histories of prices, including the current, such that this constraint always holds, no matter whether we are in equilibrium or off equilibrium. Okay? Now, for most of the time, this is kind of in the background, and I would not talk about it. Here's a simple example of a feasible policy choice. You fix the interest rate and the tax rate however you like. Let's keep them non-negative for simplicity. And you just issue debt to make the budget constraint hold. Okay, so as long as this price here is not 0 or infinity, that's not a problem. For 0, we can discuss a little bit more. Okay, but that's most of the time how I think about it. So there is some constraint in the background that has to hold also off equilibrium. But most of the time today, you can forget about it. And somewhere in the appendices of papers, you will find that people have thought about it more carefully. Any questions? Okay, let's solve this model. And I go through this a bit more quickly because it's basically the same model that we have seen before. So each household chooses consumption and the portfolio weight in bonds to maximize utility, the log utility objective, subject to this net worth evolution. So you get to consume something that subtracts from your net worth, and then the rest of your net worth grows at some return that depends how you allocate your wealth into bonds and into capital. Okay? What's the return on bonds? Or let me start with the return on capital. So capital, each unit of capital produces 1 unit of apples, 1 apple. But then the government comes along and taxes away tau apples from you. So what you get to keep is just 1 minus tau. So your dividend yield is that 1 minus tau, your after-tax cash flow, divided by what you pay for the asset, which is QK. And then there's a capital gains rate from the change in QK. And then there's no risk because I have shutdown risk. Okay, so this is deterministic. For the bond, it's the same. As Markus said, the payoff or the cash flow for the bond is the primary surplus. Here there's no government spending, so primary surplus is just a tax revenue. That's this guy here, divided by the asset price, that's the dividend yield, as a capital gains rate. All right, optimal choices. Log utility, these guys all consume a constant fraction of their net worth. You have seen this today all the time. Second, portfolio choice. We always said excess return is equal to required risk premium, which is price of risk times risk. For this model, forget about the second part because there is no risk. So basically, in a risk-free setting, all returns have to earn the same, or all assets have to earn the same return. These guys need to be equal. You set them equal, you get this condition that says the expected appreciation in the relative price between bonds and capital must equal the difference in the 2 dividend yields. If you do international, you can think this is like a type of interest parity type of condition. If capital pays a higher dividend yield than bonds, you must expect the bonds to appreciate to be willing to hold both of them. Okay? Okay, so optimal portfolio choice in equilibrium, that's just individual decision problems, is we impose market clearing. And before I do that, let me do a little bit of rewriting that might be a bit opaque, but it makes the algebra easier later on, and I just skipped some steps in between. I'm going to write this condition from the last slide, this guy, in terms of this theta that Markus also introduced, which is the share of total wealth that's due to bonds. Okay? And with a bit of algebra and some other conditions, you can show that the equation from the last slide is equivalent to this equation. This equation is in terms of this appreciation rate of this wealth share, this bond wealth share. And then I integrate that up over time. There's also a transversality condition here that always holds that says this equation is equivalent to this here. Var theta t is equal to the integral from today until the infinite future over rho times e to the power of something where you discount at rho times all these future taxes. Okay? And that has to be equal in equilibrium to the actual portfolio share that all agents choose. That's asset market clearing. Okay? So basically, I've used these portfolio choice and asset market clearing to express the equilibrium portfolio share that agents invest into bonds as some function of expected future taxes, basically some weighted average. This is like an exponential density. So this integrates to 1 without a tau. So this is literally, because of the units I've chosen, some weighted average over the future taxes. In a more general model, you would have to normalize the taxes a little bit, but forget that for now. Okay, so simple example. If I make the tax rate constant, then the theta in equilibrium must also be constant and equal to the tax rate. Okay, that makes everything in this model very simple. Okay, so what we take away from this is that the portfolio choice basically depends on the taxes. Why does that make sense? Well, in this example, for example, if I have a tax rate of 1/2, that means half of the revenue that comes from the capital, I take away and give to the bondholders. So of course, bonds pay half of the economy's output to their bondholders. So it should be that in equilibrium, 1/2 of the wealth is due to bonds. Okay, it kind of passes the sanity check. Okay, one remark. I talk a lot about portfolio choice here in a very financy language. When you usually read an FTPL paper, they would confront you with this equation, which is like a valuation equation for the bonds. These two guys are equivalent. I prefer the portfolio choice because I think it generalizes the ideas somewhat nicer to later when we have bubbles. But a more conventional way is to look at this valuation equation. And these two are, as I said, equivalent. The interpretation of the valuation equation is the households are basically willing to absorb any amount of bonds as long as they expect that there are sufficient future taxes to back them. Okay, now let me get to price level determination. That's the thing we actually care about here. Okay, so what we have seen is that fiscal policy, the tau, the taxes, affects the portfolio choice between bonds and capital, and therefore the relative price between those two assets, bonds and capital. So the question now is what affects, and that is much more general than price level determination, what affects the absolute level of asset prices in this economy? The answer is on the slide, the consumption savings choice that we haven't used so far, and wealth effects. Okay, and then of course goods market clearing. So what's goods market clearing? One, that's output, is equal to total consumption, is equal by consumption savings choice to rho times net worth, which is the value of all bonds plus the value of capital. Now, we have portfolio choice. We know theta. Okay, so I can write this guy, total wealth, as the value of all bonds divided by the share of total wealth that's invested in bonds. Okay, so it's just rewriting using the definition of theta. But we know that theta is determined by portfolio choice, so that's useful in a sense. And then I can solve this equation for QB. Then I get this. QB is equal to theta divided by rho. Everyone follows? Okay, now what is QB? QB is the value of bonds, which is the nominal value of bonds divided by the price level. So here we get an equation that relates the price level to the portfolio weight that these guys invest into bonds. And BT is a state variable from the perspective of time t, the nominal debt. So that's, in a sense, when we go to time, when we are in time t, in period t, BT is fixed. Okay, BT doesn't adjust to clear market. The only variables that could possibly adjust are the portfolio choice, but we have talked about that, and the price level. So in a sense, this equation determines the price level. But it's not very controversial. I've just told you goods market clearing determines the price level. You would probably have thought so as an economics undergrad. Okay, but the kind of interesting thing is that we have traced the price level to some asset market condition and some portfolio choice condition. Okay, so the previous result suggests, let me just repeat some of what I've said before, that portfolio choice can determine the price level when we have nominal assets, here the government bond. The economic logic, and that's where I get a bit repetitive, is the following. Theta is given in the bond market or in the asset market. Suppose the price level is too high, then total wealth, which is, so QB is inversely related to the price level. Price level too high means QB is too low. Total wealth is going to be too low. There's insufficient goods demand, which is just rho times total wealth. The goods market doesn't clear. The price level has to fall to clear the goods market, okay, because we have excess demand. Similar story, if P is too low, then total wealth is going to be too high because bonds are too valuable. We have too much goods demands, and prices have to rise to clear the goods market. So that's the simple story here. And key to this logic is that some asset value is here fixed in normal terms, the bond, so that changes in the price level affect total wealth. Otherwise, you wouldn't get that mechanism. Okay? And another key to the logic that I have sneaked in is that our var theta is somehow not reacting, or not, at least not so much, to the price level to undo that. Because here I have said the price level changes, QB changes. But if var theta changed to offset that, the logic would go out of the window. Okay? We're going to consider that later. Yes?
So, but don't we need fiscal policy to be active? So
yeah, exactly. So that's what I'm going to talk about in 3 slides, I think. That fiscal policy is going to determine to what extent that var theta is determined independently of the price level, or the price level and this var theta are jointly determined. Okay? And that's a good question. Okay, so why is this called the fiscal theory of the price level? Because it's all about fiscal stuff. Okay? Nominal government bonds and tax policy play a key role in the previous argument. We have seen the tax policy is what determines this portfolio choice. And because the bonds are nominal, the price level is related to the total wealth, and that gives us these wealth effects in the goods market. Okay, so that's why we call this the FTPL. And I will comment a little bit later on in what sense government bonds might be different to private bonds. happens in this theory. But hold on to that. Okay, so this slide is unfortunately a little bit full, so let me go slowly. Let's go to equilibrium selection. What I've done so far is I have looked at one given equilibrium, I've manipulated some equilibrium conditions, and I've pointed out a relationship between the price level and fiscal policy. Okay? So I've used the equilibrium equations that pin down the price level, portfolio choice and goods market clearing, and I have told you an economic story, how the equilibrating mechanism might work. The focus of the FTPL literature is to make one aspect of that equilibrating mechanism a little bit more formal by asking the following question. Is the equilibrium unique, or at least, is the price level across equilibria unique? Usually they ask this question, but I think this is the right way to pose it. Sometimes people point out the FTPL doesn't work, and they start with a framework that has multiplicity for reasons that are completely unrelated to nominal stuff. Of course, it doesn't work because there are multiple equilibria in your real model. But then the question is the price level still somewhat reasonably behaved? Okay, whether the FTPL can be used as a selection device, so answer yes to this question. That depends on fiscal policy, and there comes in your question. What is sometimes called active fiscal policy, that terminology is due to Lieber. There is some other terminology by Woodford, Ricardian, non-Ricardian. To what extent that's equivalent and not equivalent, we can discuss another time. If there's active fiscal policy, which I won't define, but which means intuitively that taxes do not, or at least not strongly enough, react to the value of debt to stabilize it, then the FTPL is going to select a unique equilibrium price level. Okay? If there is so-called passive fiscal policy, meaning that taxes rise in response to rising debt levels, so you see more debt, you think you have a higher liability, so you raise the taxes, and the FTPL is not going to select a unique equilibrium. Don't get confused by active and passive. An active policy can be fairly inactive. You just set the taxes and leave them where they are. And a passive policy may require a lot of actions because you have to adjust taxes. Okay? So this terminology might be somewhat confusing, but it's really meant that active means well, it comes out of a very specific type of paper. It means that you're pursuing some active objective, whereas passive means you're responding to something else in the economy. All right, any questions? Please interrupt me anytime if anything's unclear. Okay, so let me not go into detail on generality, but just provide two examples. One, how does active policy generate uniqueness? It's just a continuation of what I've done so far. Suppose we fix the tax rate to constant. And to make a feasible policy, we do something with the interest rate and bond growth that makes it a feasible policy. This is a background I won't talk about that. I have showed you before, portfolio choice and asset market clearing alone determine that the portfolio weight into bonds must be tau, independent of what happens on the goods market. Then the whole previous logic that I gave you tells you theta is constant, that the price level, which is just this object from goods market clearing, must be equal to some constant that depends on parameters times the nominal bond level. Okay, so you have no other choice, this equation holds in all equilibria, then given the normal bond level to set the price level that way. So in this case, for given B, the price level is uniquely determined. That tells us immediately the time zero price level is uniquely determined because B0 is given. It's a state variable. With a little bit of extra work, you can also show that the evolution of B is unique, and therefore the whole price level sequence is going to be unique. Okay? So if you just fix the taxes no matter what, which is a feasible policy if you do the right thing with debt growth, then you get a unique equilibrium with a unique price level. And that would be active fiscal policy, even though fiscal policy doesn't do anything, but that is the terminology. Okay? They are not reacting with their taxes to the value of debt. Okay, what about passive fiscal policy? Passive fiscal policy is the idea that you do react to the debt. Again, one example, suppose the taxes are linear in the theta. So what I really want is taxes are linear in the value of debt. You could have an intercept, makes the algebra more complicated, doesn't change the argument. I set it to 0. This one is a little bit easier, even though it's a little bit more opaque. So taxes are some linear function of theta, and I normalize it in the following way. So there's alpha divided by rho, alpha is larger than 0. Of course, you could also redefine alpha divided by rho as another constant. Okay, let's look at our equation, our portfolio choice plus asset market clearing equation for theta. Okay, that says theta is equal to some future average of future taxes. And let's plug in this tax function. And then you see there's a constant alpha that's positive times something that depends on the future thetas. Okay? And if you look at this carefully enough, you see already this is kind of a linear objective in the whole a linear equation in the whole sequence of thetas. If I multiply this side and this side by any constant, if it holds initially, it will still hold. Okay? So there's no way there's just one sequence that's going to make this equation hold. And in fact, you can transform it into an ordinary differential equation. This is the general solution. Theta t is equal to some theta 0 that can be any real number times e to the power of rho minus alpha times t. Okay? And there is another condition that I have ignored so far, a transversality condition. In this descaled world, it looks like that. So that theta cannot grow too fast. It must grow at a smaller rate than rho. But if alpha is positive, that's satisfied. Okay? So if alpha is positive, then the fiscal authority reacts sufficiently to the value of debt so that it makes this equation hold for any theta. So no matter what portfolio the private sector chooses, the fiscal authority is going to change the taxes, at least eventually, in a way that the value of the debt is equal to the present value of future taxes. Okay, that is basically the idea here. And in this case, the corollary is that for that fiscal policy, any initial portfolio weight, subject to possibly non-negativity conditions, and any initial price level are consistent with some equilibrium. Does that make sense? Yes?
But then in this scenario, can we just add a Taylor rule into taking addition, changing the
Okay. This year I'm not going to talk about Taylor rules. I did that last year. So Taylor rules are about the interest rate. And Taylor rules will get you something back that is called local determinacy that drive all the other equilibria, except for one, off far away from one equilibrium. They would not be ruled out here unless you rule out those equilibria in some other way. But you're right that that is basically the approach, and then there are some ways to make the Taylor rules global equilibrium selection devices. Let me sidestep that because I don't talk about that today. But you're right, Taylor rules are one way to say partially overcome, even though they have been criticized, this issue. Okay? But that's not what I'm talking about today. Let me, however, point out, even if we do passive fiscal policy, and indeed that is a bit the conventional assumption in New Keynesian economics, passive fiscal policy plus Taylor rule that you suggest to get an equilibrium, even then, the relationships between fiscal variables and the value of government bonds, they still hold. Okay? It's just that the fiscal side accommodates changes in the price level in a way to make the portfolio choice consistent with it. Okay? But that means different equilibria are still going to be associated with different predictions for fiscal variables. And I think that part is sometimes ignored in that literature that just ignores the fiscal side because they say we have a Taylor rule and that selects everything. So here's an example. It's very crude, but still. Let's just take any nominal path for nominal debt. And suppose we have a passive fiscal policy rule. And let me make alpha equal to rho so that you just keep the debt constant at whatever level it is initially. And I don't have sunspots, so it's just a times zero. It's just a times zero type of coordination. But you could add sunspots, then you can get random fluctuations each period. Okay? So I have here 3 price level paths. If the price level is low, then the value of debt and the share of total wealth that's tied up in debt must be large, okay? Because the value of debt is B divided by P. The government commits to hold that constant, meaning it commits to raise a lot of taxes, okay, to make that happen. Otherwise, if the government wasn't raising so many taxes, the private sector wouldn't want to hold so much of its wealth in bonds because it knows it doesn't get enough of a payout. If the price level is very high, the value of bonds is low, and you get the opposite, that the government taxes much less. So that is the side effect of such an active fiscal policy. Fiscal policy reacts to what's the value of its debt. So if you think that there are only certain regions of taxes that are plausible, you can still shrink down the set of equilibria somewhat by this additional assumption that some tax rates are just not plausible, which means you cannot be globally passive. You can only maybe be locally passive. But if you go beyond your bounds of fiscal capacity, you have to be active because you just cannot react to the rising debt anymore. So that's something useful to keep in mind, even if you say all this fiscal theory stuff, or at least the active stuff doesn't make any sense. Some people say that. That should still make sense to you because that really comes out of any model. Okay, so one question that you might ask, or maybe also not, Markus, how am I doing in time, by the way?
Pretty good.
Really? How much do I have left? Okay, then I'm actually too slow, but it's fine. So what is special about government bonds? Let me nevertheless ask that question, because there seems to be also a lot of confusion out there. So what I've talked about, nominal portfolio choices, some asset is fixed in nominal units, could apply to private bonds, no? Could apply to bank deposits, and so on. So there are 2 points that I want to point out, though. The first is to get these aggregate wealth effects to work that move the price level, you need something that represents net wealth for those people who are active as on the demand side of the goods market, your consumers, okay? The government bonds are that, even if there are taxes, okay? Because the taxes here are on capital, which is not a nominal asset. If we had an endowment, the taxes are also not on a nominal asset. So even if there's recurring equivalents and taxes and stuff like that, you still have that the bonds, the part that's nominally fixed, is still net wealth in a certain sense. So it's affected by the price level. That gets these wealth effects to work. If you think about other assets, if I have a bank deposit, I'm the shareholder of the bank, but for me it's a liability. Markus has the deposit, for him it's an asset, then in the aggregate it tends to wash out, okay? So that is the problem that you have to, that is the hurdle you have to clear to make a similar story work for other assets. For the unique, that's just between the connection between fiscal variables and the price level. For the uniqueness part of the FTPL, this active policy that determines a unique equilibrium, it's plausible to argue that active policy only works for the government. Okay? Why is that? Because the government has a liability that represents a liability to something it can create. So literally, in reality, a treasury bill gives the government the liability to pay $1. But the government can call up the Fed and say, I mean, maybe institutionally there are restrictions, but in principle, the Treasury can call up the Fed and say, put some reserves into whoever holds that Treasury in that bank's reserve account. Okay? And then the government has paid the legal liability in dollars. In the FTPL, we usually abstract from dollars and think about the liability as being just next period's bonds. For any other entity, it's not true that you can just create costlessly that liability. If I want to pay a dollar liability, I have to get my hands on dollars. And if I cannot create them, I have to expend real resources to buy those dollars from someone else to repay my debt. Okay? So once you think about that seriously, you will realize a type of active policy without default doesn't really work for anyone who owes something that you can't create, because then you have to expend real resources, and then the prices of the relative price between real resources and the nominal unit matters for you. Okay? So that is something to keep in mind. However, this doesn't mean that the government is special because it's a large player, because it can tax others, or because taxes are payable in money. These are all stories that are sometimes told. What is special about the government is that it owes something it can create. If I owe something I can create, then I can determine the nominal unit for these tokens. Okay? It's probably 0 because no one wants to trade them. But in principle, that is how it works. If you have a company that issues stock, okay, then we wouldn't think about that company as having a debt liability. And when the price of the stock goes up, you have to raise your dividends so that you make the valuation equation between the price of the stock and the present value of dividends hold. No, you think markets are wrong, and at some point they will realize, and the price of the stock will go down again. Okay? So think about this really more as equity than as debt for the government. For any other entity, it's debt. Okay, let's talk about Sargent. Yes?
Does that not also work with the service flows that we talked about? Because like with service flows, that and trade the corporate sector.
Okay, I will not talk about this much, but it's a good question. So what about service flows? I'm afraid I will not get here a lot, but when we have idiosyncratic risk and when we have service flows, then, as Markus said, you can trade these assets, and that is nice for you. But again, there comes this net wealth type of comment. If I issue debt, then you can use my debt to trade. That gives you a service flow, just as well as you can suppose my debt is as liquid as treasury debt. However, if I have idiosyncratic risk myself, then I'm levered, and I have to bear more idiosyncratic risk. So if I don't care about that idiosyncratic risk, then I have created safe assets for the economy as a whole. But if I care just as much as you about the idiosyncratic risk, then I'm going to demand more treasuries to do my retrading. And in the end, again, this zero net supply debt claim that I issued washes out in the aggregate. So that's the basic idea, that even when you have service flows, it's still mainly stuff that in the aggregate matters, okay? So only to the extent that individual agents have different idiosyncratic desires to share risk, you get anything out of that. But we can talk about this more after. Okay, let's talk about Sargent and Wallace, because that was announced in the title that Markus said as a homework to me. What is the difference to Sargent and Wallace? Okay, sorry for the long slide. I should have split it to two. Okay, Sargent and Wallace, let me call that SW, point the following out, that even in an economy that satisfied monetarist assumptions, okay, so now we are going to have money, monetary policy cannot permanently control inflation. It's not exactly what they say, I cut out some pieces, but it's basically what they mean. They consider an economy in which the price level is fully determined by the money supply. There's a quantity equation that holds, so there is no way the fiscal theory mechanism that I've just explained works exactly in that model, because money really does the trick. But the fiscal authority is going to be dominant in the following sense. It sets deficits, so now we talk about deficits, not taxes and surpluses, independently of monetary policy actions. And eventually, the fiscal authority is going to take over control of the money supply to pay for its deficits. Okay, so that's the story that they emphasize, seigniorage for money creation. You have fiscal needs that determine the total present value of seigniorage, and as long as the fiscal authority is dominant, eventually they take over the money supply. The monetary authority can provide less seigniorage now and have a tight monetary policy, but only at the expense of providing more seigniorage later, because it has this, basically the fiscal authority imposes as a constraint on the monetary authority what present value of seigniorage they have to provide. So the monetary authority can only time, in a sense, when they have the inflation, but they cannot in the long run determine inflation. So that's the point of that paper, which is of course much older than the fiscal theory papers. The similarity to the FTPL is that they also emphasize the importance of the fiscal side for price level determination and inflation. So that's the main similarity. There are some differences, in my view. Maybe you disagree. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. So one is that I think in Sargent and Wallace, seigniorage plays a very important role, but it's not really relevant for the FTPL. There was no seigniorage in the model I've just presented. So there's something else about normal government debt and the mechanism in the FTPL that has nothing to do with kind of resources the government generates from seigniorage. It's more like off-equilibrium seigniorage that it dilutes its bonds, but it never in equilibrium generates any fiscal revenue from that. Then the FTPL talks mainly, the basic FTPL, about tax backing and primary surpluses. Sargent and Wallace is all about funding deficits. Okay, so the FTPL is you raise taxes to back your debt, and then you buy it back in a sense, and that gives it value. Whereas the Sargent and Wallace is you want to fund deficits, and you need someone else to give you the resources, because it's not taxes. So you need the monetary authority to do that. I think if you switch to surpluses, even the Sargent and Wallace setting looks much more FTPL-ish, because the government is just absorbing the money. It doesn't matter whether the monetary authority prints it, because the government just takes it, the fiscal authority just takes it back in and holds it on its account. Okay, so finally, Sargent and Wallace is just consistency of policy choices along an equilibrium path. Again, it has been written much earlier, whereas FTPL talks a lot about this off-equilibrium stuff and equilibrium uniqueness. And price level determination in Sargent and Wallace is actually based on this money demand that I told you in the very beginning. Goes away once you have interest rate policy. So in fact, price level determination doesn't actually work under the modern way of modeling monetary policy as interest rate policy. Okay, so then in Sargent and Wallace, the price level will actually not I believe, not be determined. I don't know actually how you set it up exactly with interest rate policy. I haven't done that.
Sorry,
Yes?
I'm probably not understanding, but the Sargent and Wallace argument seems kind of circular because they're saying if the federal government says it has given fiscal needs and like a need for given deficits that we take exogenous, and it therefore constrains monetary policy, then monetary policy cannot ultimately determine the inflation rate. But that feels like we are assuming that the fiscal authority ultimately has the power already, and then it just seems like a trivial conclusion.
Well, exposed, it's always like that. But back in the day, I think there were all these models out there where have a kind of money supply determines the price level. And they build a model where money supply determines the price level. The monetary authority has control over the money supply, at least over some period. And then nevertheless, the fiscal needs are important. So and they actually go further than what I show you now. So that their second model is a bit less trivial because now I show you once monetary authority has no longer the power over money, then basically you get inflation. They have a second model where even before there's some inflation because of anticipation effects. So I guess, yeah, probably exposed is a little bit trivial, but I don't know whether back then it was so trivial to people. So in that sense, it's always hard to judge papers like, when was this? More than 40 years later and say, well, this is all trivial. Okay, so this is the model. I'm jumping over this because this is not really different from before. These bullet points are exactly like for B before, okay? So we have a normal quantity of money. I add that to the model. B is still there. It grows at some rate. There's an initial stock. I only make positive money growth. I make that controlled by the monetary authority. It doesn't pay interest, okay? And there's a real value that I call very imaginatively QM instead of QB. Okay, so there's now going to be a QM, a QB, and a QK. Okay, households face a payment constraint. That's my way how I engineer a very simple quantity equation into this model. It's a little bit ad hoc. I put it in production for reasons that I don't want to elaborate on. It makes the model easier. Okay, if you're really interested, I have a paper where I do other things, but I use this constraint. So it's basically you have a velocity that's constant times the money that you hold must be large or equal the value of total stuff that you produce, not consume. Okay, usually we would put consumption in a cash in advance world. When I do production, I don't distort consumption decisions, makes the model easier. Okay, this is basically what I just impose on agents. We also need this restriction, but forget about that. So basically in the aggregate, once we aggregate over everyone and use that aggregate output as 1, same model as before, except for that I add money, get this guy here. Okay, the price level is equal to velocity times money. So basically here we get a so tight link between M and P that if you set M, you have set P. There is no room anymore for anyone else to determine P. M determines P. The monetary authority is going to generate seigniorage, real seigniorage, by growing the money stock. Okay, I guess there is there's no M missing here. This is right. This is the real value of what the monetary authority creates. I call this sigma T. Maybe not best notation. Sigma here is not a volatility, but it's similar to tau. Okay, and it's S for seigniorage in a sense. So sigma is the tax revenue that you get out of money, and tau is the tax revenue that you get out of capital. And it all goes to the fiscal authority. But the monetary authority, the assumption is controls this thing. The fiscal authority has a budget constraint as before. It pays interest. It can grow its debt. It raises taxes. And it now gets seigniorage. That's the new element from the monetary authority. And then we can rearrange that again. And then what you see, if you have paid attention, is before it looked like this. So it's all the same as before the budget constraint on the fiscal authority if I just add up the taxes and the seigniorage. Okay, so just let's replace tau with tau plus sigma. And then I also will not bother you with all the detailed equations. At the end of the day, the portfolio choice is going to give you that the share of total wealth that private agents want to put into bonds, so that's now QB divided by the sum of these three, is equal to this guy. Okay, forget this line for a moment. To this guy. It's the same as before, just that I have, instead of tau, I write here tau plus sigma. Okay, the derivation is basically the same. Now let me make some assumptions. The assumption is that in equilibrium, so here I just look at one equilibrium and conditions that are consistent with with that this is an equilibrium. The payment constraint is always binding, so that this quantity equation always holds and money controls the price level. And the second assumption is the fiscal authority just sets tau equal to minus delta, where delta is positive for deficit. So there's a constant deficit now. It's not a constant surplus. Okay? So I replace this tau by minus delta. So then once I compute this integral, I get minus delta. So the share in bonds must be the present value or the average seniorage, where we average with this exponential thing, minus delta. And because of the first assumption, the share that the private sector invests into money must be constant. Okay, that comes out of the quantity equation directly. Yes?
Are you forcing the choice that the monetary authority have to make to be such that the money value is decreased? And if you are, is this called general?
Do you ask me, am I forcing that the monetary authority chooses this in line with this equation?
No. Can we go one slide back?
Yeah.
Are you for, like, when you say that it chooses mu TM, it can give like a Poisson shot that makes the money level jumps?
Oh, I don't do Poisson. I do everything absolutely continuous. There is no risk anyway. So that I'm forcing, yes. Also, I wouldn't know how it would. Yeah, I could do that, but you could generalize that. But I don't see the point. This is all a deterministic model, so I'm just making it absolutely continuous. So instead of waking up and printing a lot of money within a nanosecond, they spread it out over a few days. But you can approximate arbitrarily well a continuous jump, a deterministic jump. It's just Poisson has also the risk component to it. That I don't allow, but simply for simplicity. Okay, let me look at the time. I think I don't have so much time left. So okay, these are the two pricing equations. That's again just portfolio choice from the point of view of the consumers. Then there's some goods market layering that gives you the absolute level of assets, but that's in the background here. Okay, so let me do the following experiment, what they call a fiscally dominant regime. Until time t, cap t smaller than infinity, the monetary authority chooses mu m, and I make it constant, okay, for simplicity, but it could be different than constant. But after time cap t, the fiscal authority takes over the printing press, and it chooses mu m in a way that the seniorage is just enough to keep the level of debt constant. And you can compute you need that level of seniorage, conditional on that being the share of total wealth that's in debt at time cap t, to keep the level of debt constant. Let's ignore that there might be feasibility limits just for simplicity. Okay, there might be. So that's the idea. Before cap t, the monetary authority can do what it wants, but at cap t, the Fed comes, the Treasury comes in, takes the printing press, and says, from now on, you produce this much seniorage. So the monetary authority, I would just assume they have a constant money growth before time cap t, and that generates constant seniorage because QM is constant in this model. Okay, I have cooked it in a way to make it easy. Then you get the proposition that we might call trivial. That's the unpleasant arithmetic of Sargent and Wallace. Tighter money now means higher inflation later, eventually. Okay, more specifically, this is just words. The constant inflation rate over capital T to infinity is strictly decreasing in the money growth between time 0 and time t. Okay, so the more money I grow now as a monetary authority, the less inflation I get after the fiscal authority takes over. Okay, why does this hold? It's very easy because ultimately the seniorage in the future depends on the level of debt when the fiscal authority takes over. And if that level of debt is higher, they need to raise more seniorage. So they will generate more inflation down the road. So how does that level of debt get high in the future? If I don't provide a lot of seniorage revenue to them now, because they are just running their constant deficit and take whatever seniorage I give to them to fund it, and the difference they fund with debt growth. They don't change their taxes. That's the assumption. Okay? So basically, when sigma, the seniorage I give them, is smaller as a monetary authority, they will have more debt once they take over, and they will have to print more money to fund their constant deficit that they still want to run. And on top of that, also fund the interest payments of the larger debt. Okay? So that is basically the idea. Let me just give you that in a picture. Suppose we're in the blue scenario. I'm the monetary authority. I set the seigniorage and money growth. This is just schematic. They're just constantly, they are proportional at this line. Then the fiscal authority takes over. That's the level of debt they have. They try to figure out how much seigniorage do I need to fund my deficit. Well, it's that much, it's the blue line. Now, if I contemplate as a monetary authority to lower the inflation rate now while I'm in control, I can do that. But then I transfer less seigniorage to these guys. They grow their debt at a faster rate. They have a higher interest rate bill here. And what are they going to do? They instruct the new Fed chair, give me even higher seigniorage. Okay? So that's the mechanism in Sargent Wallace. It's all about redistribution of seigniorage over time. Does that make sense? Okay, one more thing. What about the monetary dominance? We could also think about that. What if cap T is infinity? The monetary authority does what it wants. The fiscal authority never takes control. Okay, is there an equilibrium? Suppose also we don't have this knife edge case where they just coincide in what they want to do. The answer is not, under the assumptions I've made, constant deficit and binding constraint. But that's not necessarily a feasible policy anyway. Okay? So once we think about it more carefully, and I jump over this case, okay, if the seigniorage is actually too large. Okay, this is a bit more FTPL style. But suppose the seigniorage is too small relative to what the fiscal authority wants. Then at some point, possibly at time 0, the fiscal authority is not able to sell more bonds to the private sector and at the same time commit to this constant deficit. Why? Because the private sector knows they don't get enough payments. Okay? So now the fiscal authority has to default, or possibly it does default in the beginning, or it has to raise its taxes to make up for the gap. Okay? So it lowers the deficit. One of those options. So in that case, the fiscal authority faces something like an intertemporal budget constraint, and it has to adjust to that constraint. Why is that? Because now government debt is more like real or foreign currency debt, because the fiscal authority has no control over the printing press. So it owes something it cannot create. And that makes it very different from the FTPL. Okay? Yes?
Why is it not just ask fiscal policy in research?
Well, that's different, because in the LIPA setting where there is no, I don't know whether LIPA has money, but often people nowadays, they just throw out money. And then the only positive net supply asset is the bond. Okay? So the first answer is that if the price level is really the relative price between bonds and goods, then this channel doesn't bite because the fiscal authority can create bonds. But the second answer is that this whole story only works if the government wants to raise deficits. If the fiscal authority wants to raise the surpluses, it's going to absorb money anyway. What the monetary authority does is then much less important. Then we always get an FTPL-like idea. So in a LIPA-type setting where taxes are positive or surpluses are positive, what the monetary authority does with the normal interest rate will just throw you on some explosive path if the fiscal authority does what it wants. Okay? So there's still an equilibrium. It just doesn't look good for the price level. Okay. Do I have 5 minutes or out of time? Or even more? No, let me know. Let me know. Okay, let's try 7 maybe. Okay, FTPL with a bubble. Let's go back to the interesting stuff. Okay, so this was not macrofinance. There was no risk. There was no financial frictions and so on. This was just some more generic monetary economics, partially also very old stuff, Sargent and Wallace. Let's go to the FTPL with a bubble. The FTPL with a bubble is basically, I mean, it could be many frameworks, but our baseline framework is the same that Markus presented without aggregate risk. And when you have a bubble on government debt, you can generate seigniorage. So seigniorage comes back, but it doesn't come in the form of money, but it comes in the form of debt growth. Okay? Usually how we would motivate this is, well, if you have R smaller than G, you may have rational bubbles, including on government debt. Markus said that already. What do we do with this equation? It might not hold. And that's usually how the FTPL is presented, based on that equation. That equation might not hold, so that looks like trouble for the FTPL. So that is then the first question. Does the FTPL even work in such a setting? And if so, how? Then we also observed that the government can raise seniorage from mining the bubble, from growing bonds, has nothing to do with money demand that I just had presented before. So there might be some interest to keep the bubble attached to the government debt. Can the government do that? Okay. There are other questions about welfare that we asked in the paper. So this is our paper about the FTPL with a bubble. I won't talk about that. I will ask these two questions. Can the FTPL work? How? And how can the government make sure the bubble is on its debt, not somewhere else? And the way I've presented the FTPL, you might not even see why there is a big problem when there's a bubble, because I haven't used that equation. I have focused on portfolio choice that might still hold even if there are bubbles. Okay? So what's the model I have in mind? The model is basically the model I presented, constant capital endowments, but now I make them fluctuating. I get a positive shock, someone in a room gets a negative shock. So the aggregate capital is still 1, but each of us has idiosyncratic risk. Okay? So now the capital evolution of each guy, so throw out the money from the Sargent and Wallace. We are back in the bond capital world. Each guy has capital, and that changes because you trade it or because you get a shock. And now the trading matters because we have seen that these guys trade bonds for capital, and that generates a service flow. Actually, there would be a service flow even without trading, but let's not talk about that. Okay, bonds represent a safe asset. That's what Markus has discussed. We have also seen if sigma tilde, sorry, there's a tilde missing, is sufficiently large, then rational bubbles may emerge. Well, why is that? Because we have a precautionary savings motive. The interest rate is basically the time preference rate. There's no growth minus precautionary savings. If idiosyncratic risk is large enough, the interest rate is negative. Here, in my setting, the growth rate is 0, so the interest rate is smaller or equal than the growth rate. And then we can have bubbles. Okay? So that's the framework. So does the FTPL still work? I emphasized there are 2 FTPL ingredients that are important. And one is fiscal policy affects the portfolio demand for nominal government debt, which is about relative asset prices. The second is there are some wealth effects coming from the price level to the total value of nominal bonds, okay, and that ultimately affects the price level. Both ingredients are still here. The first one, let's look at the portfolio choice condition. I spare you the derivation, but it's very similar to what Markus has shown you. The equilibrium portfolio weight that agents want to hold in bonds is equal to this term that we had before, this weighted average future taxes. That's the cash flow component. Markus had a surplus here. I don't have government spending, so that's the same. And then there's a second term that we have called the service flow term. Okay, I've rewritten it slightly here, but it's the same idea. So you get some idiosyncratic risk term that depends how much valuable is capital times how valuable is bonds. Okay, there's the service flow. But tau still appears here. So in some sense, the fiscal policy still plays an important role for this theta. It isn't the only thing that appears here. There's other stuff, but it's one thing. Okay, and the link between theta and p is just as before. Okay, so once you determine theta, you effectively determine p as a function of how much nominal paper do we have in this economy. Okay, so that link still is there, okay? That link in a given equilibrium between fiscal policy and a price level still exists. But does that mean we can get rid of multiplicity, which is a little bit more than just establishing a link between fiscal policy and a price level? We have to ask, is there a fiscal policy that can use that link in a way to make all price levels but one non-equilibrium things? So one is consistent with equilibrium. Okay, now we have 2 sources of equilibrium. Number 2 is the one we had before, the normal indeterminacy that the price level by itself is not determined unless we do something like active fiscal policy to make it determined. But now there's another bubble indeterminacy. The bubble is ultimately something about coordination. A bubble only emerges because I believe that others buy the asset at a high price. So we can always coordinate on a no bubble equilibrium. In a richer model, we can also coordinate on an equilibrium where the bubble is on another asset than government debt. There's nothing special about government debt, okay? So that also exists. Now, FTPL arguments we show in the paper can resolve both. The idea is that you do the tax backing, that you have in equilibrium in the FTPL with active policy. The value of debt is the present value of taxes. You kind of move that into off-equilibrium threats, so to say. So if the private sector coordinates on a different equilibrium, then you start taxing and bringing back the standard FTPL without bubbles, and make that debt, in a sense, valuable. But you do it in a way that this promise remains off equilibrium. So you have to work a bit how to do that, okay? And that requires some credibility and some fiscal capacity and so on, okay? Otherwise, it doesn't work. Okay, two things. First, if you have active fiscal policy and you keep the, sorry,
quick question. So 2 slides back?
2 slides back.
You said that the government has controlled cash flow up here, the part,
Yes.
like they do in the fiscal theory of the price level?
Yes, they control this
Are
guy.
we assuming if they're on the equilibrium path that they don't have control of the service flow?
Well, they don't. So the theta is in equilibrium. So I've imposed already asset market clearing, but not necessarily goods market clearing for this equation. So theta is both the relative price, the wealth share, the price of bonds divided by total wealth, and it is the wealth share that individual agents allocate to bonds. These are the same because I've imposed clearing on the asset market. But the government doesn't have any control. I don't think about the government as choosing the portfolios for the agents or imposing taxes directly on the portfolio choice. So in this framework, the government has no control over the thetas directly. The instrument that it can use is this guy. But it can, of course, induce, it can change, given my expectation of future theta, if I change the taxes, then agents today want to hold a different theta. So possibly I can still somehow induce them to pick a certain path of theta and indirectly pick the service flow. So that still works. But you cannot directly pick it independently of this guy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so maybe if I can do a follow-up. So in the equilibriums where the bubble pops, is that saying, in those equilibriums, does the service flow go away? Is that the point?
Yeah, well, let's be careful about that. So if you put theta, if there are no taxes, okay, and the bubble pops, so that's a simple case. There are no taxes ever. The bubble pops. Theta is going to be 0 in that no bubble equilibrium. Then there's no service flow. But you could have a situation where the bubble pops, and in reaction to that, the government raises some surpluses now, positive taxes, because it doesn't want a 0 value of debt. Then the value of debt would be positive. This equation still holds. The service flow is also positive. Okay? Does that make sense?
But the bubble still pops in that.
The bubble might still pop, yes. Then there is no bubble anymore. So let's maybe defer that to dinner, because it gets a bit more difficult once we discuss the details. And let me just wrap up this one, okay? Let me just go to the main argument. Okay, so if we have positive taxes forever, standard FTPL works also with idiosyncratic risk. But R is larger than G. Markus told you about that he had this mu check, but the taxes is just a negative of the mu check times some variable, okay? So if you have always positive taxes, R is larger than G, that's coming out of the model, there's no bubble. So the FTPL works, but you don't get an equilibrium bubble. Okay, so that is the first result. It's perhaps a bit boring, because it's not really an FTPL with a bubble. It's an FTPL that destroys the bubble. But you can do better, okay? We really want that bubble mining on the equilibrium path. So can we somehow shift this idea to the off equilibrium so that on the equilibrium path we can still mine the bubble? That's a bit more challenging, okay? A continuum of bubble values are consistent with the same tax path once we have taxes that are consistent with bubbles, okay? And in fact, an exogenous tax sequence is A, insufficient, and B, if it's negative, it's not even feasible in the sense I defined before. Okay? If the value of government bonds is very low, I cannot run a deficit because the private bond market doesn't fund me. Okay? So you have to think about more carefully what is feasible policy. Once you do that, and we do that in a paper, you can devise a contingent policy that depends on the value of the government debt that still selects your desired equilibrium. You run primary deficits on the equilibrium path, but once the value of debt of equilibrium, so not once in the sense of time that at some point it happens, but in the off equilibrium contingency that the value of debt goes below a certain threshold, you start to raise your taxes. And you do that in a way that that below threshold value is also not another equilibrium. Okay? In the interest of time, let me switch that and just show you the picture. Okay? So we can show that if you look at this theta equation that I showed you all the time as an integral equation, I can turn that into a differential equation. Okay? It's a bit easier to analyze because it doesn't have this continuum of future thetas. How do I read this equation? I read this equation as given today's theta, value of theta, what do I need to believe as a private agent how theta evolves over the next instant that I'm willing to hold it? So which capital gains rate makes me indifferent? Okay? What you can show is it looks something like, oh sorry, I have to tell you the policy. First policy, we hold this mu check constant, so bond growth minus interest rate. And we vary the taxes to make the government budget constraint hold. Okay? This policy is always feasible, has this feature. There is a steady state. That's the monetary steady state Markus showed you. There's another steady state where this crosses zero. That's the bubbleless equilibrium. It's easy to rule out values above. If we ever were below the monetary steady state, suppose this is today's theta, how are agents indifferent between holding marginally more or less bonds if the capital gains rate is that value here, okay, over the next instant? Okay, so it must be negative, meaning we must expect to rationalize this value today that theta falls over time. And you see it stays negative, so it has to fall all the way to the moneyless steady state. So in a sense, in the forward dynamics, the moneyless steady state you would call stable, and the money steady state you would call unstable. Now, fortunately, it's a backward equation. So in a sense, whenever we expect a value of money that in the future will never go below some value here, the only way to rationalize that expectation is if we are actually here all the time. Because if we were here today, we would expect eventually we go below this lower bound. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is your surplus to GDP, your taxes to GDP. Now, let me change that policy. And let's say if we go below that threshold, I change my policy. Instead of fixing this mu check, I now fix the tax rate. And I make it positive, okay? Because negative is not feasible, but I make it positive. What happens now is that as a bondholder, if we are here, the value of bonds is very low. When am I indifferent to hold a little bit more, a little bit less? If I expect an even lower capital gains rate, even more negative. Why? Because I get an additional dividend. I get this positive taxes. Okay, so I need to expect that bonds depreciate even faster when the government pays taxes to rationalize this low valuation. And you see, even at zero, the valuation that the depreciation rate you need is negative. So you would have to expect that in finite time, the value of bonds turns negative. With free disposal, this won't happen, okay? So basically, here, you want to hold on to your bond because the government collects all those taxes and pays it to the last bondholder that's still there to buy back those bonds. So you want to be that last bondholder and collect all those taxes with this very cheap bond, okay? So that's why all this stuff unravels. So all these cannot be equilibria where the government taxes. But because here we expect to go there eventually, these can also not be equilibria. What remains is this guy, the steady state, okay? So that's the basic argument. It becomes much more complicated if you have alternative bubbly assets, but the idea still works. It becomes more complicated if you make the government not be able to commit. But under some conditions, it still is credible. And in the paper, we also look at some other policies, like insolvency law, restriction on using alternative assets, financial repression. And they are mainly complementary in the sense that they relax the conditions that this still all works once you have other bubbly assets or you don't have commitment. All right, that's it. You can read the summary on your own. Sorry for going a little bit over time or a lot over time. I don't know that actually. And thanks.